All right, so Jean-Claude, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks, John. It's early morning, but I had my coffee, so I'm feeling good.
Happy days, happy days. So not half
How are
asleep
you?
anymore. I know what you mean. Useless without my coffee. Useless without my coffee. But today I think is a very special occasion, right? One which I never thought I'd see, where I am luckily, well, I feel lucky enough to find myself in a conversation with a cannabis doctor, as it were, for a lack of better words, in the presence of some cannabis, both in the presence of some cannabis, might I add. And we're gonna have an interesting conversation about the industry and the medicine and what the future looks like. So this is I'm very excited.
Um, I'm just as excited as you, John. It's always a pleasure, to open a window into the um into the whole world of cannabis. So both the actual science of it and the access to it now as not a drug of abuse, but as a medicine as well. And also to ultimately talk about the industry because um, I compare it really, the industry is a mirror image of the plant because just like the plant had a very tough time with its image, let's say, its public image in the past.
Mm.
I think in the recent years, the medical cannabis industry or the cannabis industry in general for medical recreation and our purposes has just had a very bad PR on it. And I think it affects a lot of people inside and outside the industry of now doing sort of the phase two. So a few years ago we had legalization. Now we need normalization for
That I think is still a kind of ways away, at least in Europe. I'm not sure what it's like in that part of the world because you are, I believe, at the moment in Latin America, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I am in Colombia, in a really beautiful little town called Chía, north of Bogota. Um, it's actually quite progressive here, not just in Colombia, but in Latin America in general. So a lot of countries, be it obviously Uruguay is very famous because it was a pioneer.
Mm.
But even the rest of South America, so we're talking Colombia, neighboring Brazil, Costa Rica, higher up in Central America, they all have medical cannabis legalized and actually a good
Mm.
network. And there's a reason for that. And they're
So,
also similar to Europe recreationally. So they're just, legalizing, they're talking about it in Parliament. It's very similar to Europe
but you
in
did
that.
you did sort of bring up an exception there, and to that, before we sort of dive in, I'll say cheers. Let's take a little puff to commemorate this moment. I'll do this on
Okay.
a joint, and you'll use a vape. We'll sort of talk about what those are later. But
Cheers, buddy.
cheers. So I want
To a great convo.
to a great convo. So I want to touch on the Uruguay aspect, right? So most people don't know, but Uruguay was, as far as I know, the first country to legalize marijuana in a commercial setting, right? And the idea, feel free to correct me, but my understanding of it is the idea of it is they did this more than 5 years ago, and they did this to create an alternative cash crop for the local farmers, right? That's the story I understand. Now, what's your
It's basically
perspective?
it. It's basically it. With regards to Uruguay, I think what I look up to most is how assertive they were in the global aspect of it, because the way sort of going straight to getting very straight to the point and legalizing very quickly, especially at the time they did it, it caused a huge commotion, a lot of controversy.
It
So.
was it was it was
Uh,
huge in this space, and now that all this time has passed, like what lessons have we learned from Uruguay, or rather, how is Uruguay progressed as opposed to the rest of Latin America in this industry?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say I have huge expertise on Uruguay, but when you take the pioneering countries in general, and you look at what lessons they've learned and what lessons the rest of the world is taking from that, is that despite all the fear mongering, despite the very conservative approach that the larger narcotic bodies of the world have so far had. So if you look at the INCB, if you look at a lot of international organizations, various. So from the health sector,
being who? Sorry.
the INCB would be the International Narcotics Control Board. Who basically looks at and oversees aspects regarding narcotic substances around the world. And despite how conservative it was, what the data we're getting from the pioneering countries is that it's not it's not the end of the world. There are challenges, but in most cases there have been a lot of positives, and residents seem to like it. So in many countries, be it Uruguay, but also North America, like Canada, there was some data released recently that after the legislation has been passed, the residents, many of them, are more in favor of legislation, positive legislation than before. So you're actually getting more and more people saying, hey, listen, this is a good idea.
And that's sort of somewhat, Canada was somewhat an anomaly, right, in the regulatory space, because as far as I understand, again, please feel free to correct me, but it's the only country in the world that voted for the recreational use of cannabis via democratic process. It didn't. So there was a direct referendum via the people to say, like, hey, listen, do we want to make cannabis legal? Was that the case, or am I misconstrued?
Well, I mean, it's definitely something which happened democratically, in places like Canada, and there's a democratic process, and it was very swiftly
enacted,
but it didn't take that much time actually to implement. When you're talking about,
the point I'm trying to make is that the to your point, right, that the sort of mindset going in and the results post legislation were in line, right? Which I guess is one of the many risks with regulating cannabis. I mean, something most regulators fear.
They were in line. Something I want to say is that cannabis, we talked about normalization. It is in people's lives. So when you talk to people, not just in the cannabis business, but people in general, you won't get blank faces if you mention cannabis. You'll get some sort of reaction. People know about cannabis and they have an opinion towards it. Ultimately, what I can say is that the representation of cannabis legally was not in line really with what people really think about cannabis and their opinions, because ultimately there are regulations, but then people are also gaining more knowledge, and they're saying, listen, this does not make sense. When I have a personal experience with the plant, and they're saying, I might not be a doctor, I might not be a scientist, but I have experience. And I think a lot of people are seeing that in we're seeing more of those people in recent years. And ultimately, although it happens slowly, the democratic process is happening. So we're talking about periods of a few years, and 5 years, 10 years, which really isn't that long. So when you think about social change, it happens slowly. And especially when you have social change, which needs to happen before an industry can be born, it takes even longer, right? Because you have so many people who want to get on the industry bandwagon, but before that, there's a lot of social change which first needs to happen before and happy then to take it to the next level.
And this is I think like the same with sorts of most kinds of innovations, or rather, let's say every real innovation has sort of two branding sides to it, right? And while cannabis technically isn't really an innovation, the way we are using it today is vastly innovative compared to 50, 60 years ago. And as a result, there are some preconceptions and some misnomers which need to be corrected in society as a whole, I think, to your point. But you're in a unique position, I think, because you're a doctor, right? So you understand sort of the medical implications of this medicine and what it can do and what the downsides are. But more importantly, you also have exposure at regulatory level, right? So can you just tell us a little bit about what that experience was like and how you're able to combine past experiences to create a way forward?
Well, ultimately, the first thing you notice is it comes really not from medical practice, but it comes from medical science. So it's quite mainstream now to know about, that clinical study there, that trial there. People are hearing more and more about these studies involving cannabis and other narcotics, which are doing so well. But I think the first vantage point I had was being working in the mainstream hospitals and noticing that despite all this research going on, it was not filtering actually into the clinic. And my first question was why, why that is happening. And the second key insight you get is these hospitals, they don't really work according to the latest science. They work according to clinical guidelines, which are, of course, based on science, but they're also based on other things. They're based on a bit of a status quo regarding certain subjects in the scientific area, and definitely that status quo is upheld not by scientists in laboratories, unfortunately, but by people on boards. And unfortunately, the ideas that are voiced and which ultimately lead to regulations, guidelines, which really bind doctors' hands, are voiced in these boards, and they don't necessarily reflect the latest science.
I mean, and that is a sort of double-edged sword of the industry, right? I mean, from a sort of tech perspective, I'm very lucky in the fact that whatever I create, I can replicate, hundreds and thousands of times, and no one's life is affected. Just some code changes. In your case, people die, right? If something goes terribly, terribly wrong. So
we need to remember that the medical world always carries this responsibility, but it really works on different principles or different mindset to say, listen, we can't let ultimately we work on the principle first, do no harm. So rather than going to and saying who's going to die, not going to die, but ultimately the first principle in medicine is do no harm. So the concept relies on if someone is going to a doctor, the aim of that doctor is for that someone to be better off leaving
absolutely
that consultation, that experience than they went in. So when we talk about any industry, any pharmaceutical, the same thing applies. When we're talking about narcotics, because there is a complication, you need to be careful with things such as doses, because you can have things go either way. You need to ultimately be precise. It's talking about precision. And what I'm getting at is that precision comes with innovation. So although it might be counterintuitive, a very conservative approach of no, let's not study that. Let's not delve deeper into what can be right, but also delve deeper into what went wrong.
But let's sort of talk about that idea of a precision for a second, and I mean this with the utmost respect, right? But doctors are professional guessers, essentially, because what they make life-changing decisions not based on hard data for the most part, but based on ranges of data, and they're required to sort of interpret this information and transpose it into a diagnosis and then some sort of medicine afterwards, right? So I find it interesting how there's such a need for precision in an area of the world which is so like not hyper accurate. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself correctly.
No, I completely understand, John. I think what we need to keep in mind ultimately is that medicine is a very old industry. So it's been there for a long time, and certainly in times in the past and still in the present, yes, it is a bit of, let's say, professional guesswork or detective work. And this is what ultimately changes in medicine. So just as we had tech in finance, called it fintech, we have tech now in medicine, calling it medtech. And we agree that it's a good thing, because we agree that again, according to the principle of do no harm, the more you know, and the more precise you can be, the less harm you'll do. So it seems intuitive actually to think that innovation is good for medicine. But innovation in certain areas, because of stigma. So we get innovation in radiology, and that's a great thing. Innovation in narcotics always seems to be a bit more difficult, because you have people of the idea that, listen, these substances, they shouldn't be used, they shouldn't be studied, heck, they shouldn't be looked at. So ultimately, this is one of the key hallmarks of the cannabis industry, is that you still have a lot of stigma, not really holding the industry back because of legislation, because that now is changing, but also because of the normalization and the stigma, and that comes even from science. So actually getting into courses, like how many people do you know who are very interested in cannabis, are at university level or would like to pursue studies at university level, but actually go ahead with pursuing a course or doing a study based in cannabis or in
No,
psychedelics?
very few, and I think sort of that's one of the reasons why I'm so, let's say, privileged to be a part of this conversation, right? Because you need to be a special kind of person to take a leap into an industry that's not only sort of unfounded in many ways, but stigmatized to a very unfair degree. So with that, what was it? What made you decide to become a cannabis doctor?
I mean, ultimately, really coming from that principle of doing no harm, I always wanted to be innovative. I always wanted to if in the year 2000 the best was here, I wanted to be on that pioneering edge of, listen, and I want to be as futuristic and as efficient as possible. I was always wired in this way, and ultimately, from my experience, it's the key is simple. You need to be ready to advocate for what you're doing. So I think that's how I would differentiate working with psychotropics as opposed to any other aspect of science or business or whatever. Is you need to advocate, and you need to be ready to sort of be a minority and say, listen, we need to push to know more, to limit the harms that we already know about certain narcotics, but ultimately to improve the overall experience. And this counts not just for being in medicine or in science, in medical science or biological science. This counts as well if you're in tech. So because cannabis is so complicated, we found a really big area, a lot of field to cultivate in cannabis tech. So, okay, if cannabis has big sort of data issues to solve, then medtech is here to sort of conjoin those together.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people have come from the tech industry into the cannabis industry, because you'd be in the tech industry and have a predisposition for the plant. It sounds like a good idea, but many people then become disenfranchised by how different it is to work in tech, or even areas like marketing or other areas in the cannabis space, because there are these special challenges which the scientists and the doctors know all too well at this point.
It's been a long road for cannabis, but I mean, the fact that in 2023 I can go to the pharmacy and with prescription literally purchase some medicinal cannabis. With that reasoning, I see no reason why the same will not be, like, why it will not be any different for psilocybin or ketamine or any other sort of psychotropic down the line. But that's, I guess, a whole other big conversation. Talk to me
there are
a
many
little bit
conversations
about.
to be had. Yeah, one thing I would say, sorry, Jean, is ultimately it's all about using narcotics safely.
Absolutely.
It,
And to do
it
that, we need
ties in, they
data.
all tie in together.
And to do
With
that,
data,
we need
that's right,
data,
precisely and safely,
which
and
is
with that precision and safety, we get rid of these stigmas, which are really based on fables. It's not based on science, really based on a lot of stigma and a lot of fear mongering, which is just it shouldn't have its place in civil society, but it does, and that's one of the biggest challenges.
exactly. You would have thought that once a sort of society would have achieved the separation of church and state, that these issues would have been a thing of the past, but apparently not. So I want to sort of dive into this data issue a little bit more and talk a little bit more about the tech. So I was like, when we met, you had mentioned to me that the largest clinical study ever conducted in the cannabis space has been on 10,000 people. That blows my mind in the sense that how is it that a product that used to drive such a big part of the economy at some point in time, right? We're talking sheets, ropes, with forget the medicinal side, right? Like it was massive on its own in terms of everyday use, right? Just use in the economy. Like, how is it that so much time has passed and we have such little data?
When we talk about studies, study numbers are one of the biggest hurdles for logistics. And when you look at for example the larger studies, they tend to be 10,000, maybe a bit more than that, but many of them tend to be studies which are funded and which are more carried out by large organizations. It's very difficult.
That explains
for entry-level scientists, for universities especially, which are on a budget to carry out these studies. And secondly, and it's related, it's the issue of funding, how funding is applied to these studies. Because when you're funded as a scientist, normally you don't have, the free roll. Normally you do have a certain motif, a certain thematic that you need to follow.
Yeah.
And the problem is that not only do we have a lack of funding for the benefits, the therapeutic uses of cannabis, or also the social consequences of recreational use, and really delving in deeper, we actually have another problem, which is that a lot of the funding that exists is actually targeted towards a health hazard motif. So it looks at sections of population who, for some reason or other, are using the drug in a wrong manner, and we're sort of getting a bit of an inventory of what can go wrong if one is using the drug in.
But that's a different perspective, right? So as far as I understand, you're working to provide this data without any such bias, correct?
We're ultimately trying to build a cloud of data, a gathering of data, which looks at how efficient cannabis use is in people who are trying to medicate. So we're looking at a different cohort, shall we speak, but also to carry out data in general. So one also always needs to be very, very, you need to look at scientific studies with a wide angle lens and analyze. Listen, what side effects were there here? Especially in cohorts who are trying to medicate, you want to be especially even more cautious than in the general population, because these are individuals who are normally coming from bad health already. So you definitely don't want to make things worse. But also having tech which is agnostic to the data is very important, because ultimately the same tech can also be applied to recreational spaces of people who want to simply, hey, listen, let me follow what cannabis is doing for my body.
Yes.
Not to advocate, but in terms of wellness or safeguard.
You're sort of taking the Tesla model here, right? It's like, let's start with the Tesla Roadster, i.e. the hardest use case, which in your case is the patients of the actual pharmacies, and then we build the Model 3 down the line should it come to it, right? So that's the strategy. Is that fair to say?
Ultimately, it's about being able to extract good data from cannabis and from cannabis use. That's the first principle. And secondly, find good use cases for it. So the use case may be medical. The use case can be in recreational spaces, and from multiple aspects, from the user's aspect, from the aspect of the vendor, from the aspects of the professionals, the nurses and the doctors who want to be more vigilant in their patients. So ultimately, once you have a platform for cannabis data to be, first of all, used effectively between one party and the other party, and secondly, analyzed for science to improve the situation, the medical situation for everyone, to have more data for trials, to have more data for decisions at the political level, to inform the public about data before important decisions are made. We talked about the democratic process. This is why it's important to have a platform which is a place where the data can be celebrated and used to our benefit.
And it's maximum potential at the end of the day, right? I mean, that's what you're sort of pushing here, which I respect. So run me through like a use case. Let's say I am a medicinal cannabis patient. Where am I, and how does your platform help me? What's the whole process?
Okay, so let's say we have a patient with a chronic condition. Let's look at Parkinson's. And there are patients who tend to who opt to add medicinal cannabis as an adjunct to their therapy because it would help with certain aspects of living with Parkinson's symptoms. So let's say
as I understand, it helps with the shakes a little.
With the shaking, that's right, with the tremor. So let's say I'm a Parkinson's patient with tremors, and I'd like to be followed by my doctor, not just for the meds, the classic meds, but also with cannabis. So I want my doctor to explain, listen, how do I use this effectively? Using a data platform, we would be able to follow up this patient much closer. So we can say, okay, we're using cannabis for the shaking. So we want to know that the type of cannabis you're using, the time, and a lot of the different factors that we have with medicating with cannabis, we want to optimize them. So let's measure. And by measuring using cannabis tech, using cannabis hardware, such as, for example, a Fitbit or a watch, with software.
Do I have to get my own Fitbit, or do you give me a Fitbit? How does it work?
You can have your own. So ultimately, there are different types of hardware. Some of them are more medical. Some of them are general use, like the Apple Watch, an Android device. And using a platform which can work on these devices, we can extract data from the patient, and that data can be used in the first case by the patient himself to sort of say, okay, listen, I'm understanding myself. I can see that over a 2-month period, my shaking is decreased. So that's the first use case. The second use case is communicating that to the doctor. With the doctor using a platform on the other end, which can receive signals from the patient can immediately inform the doctor, listen, I'm noticing a good trend. Can we maybe talk about this? Can we discuss? Or I'm noticing a bad trend, or something went up and I'd like help from the doctors. And you have a lot of data coming in, and having tech which can simplify that data for the doctor. The doctor can say, hey, listen, after a month, we seem to be having much less shaking, so our dose seems to be working. The patient can keep that communication going for the month. So that's just one use case.
So let me just see if I understood this. Like, let me just see if I understood this. So what we're talking about is, because as far as cannabis goes, there's lots of different kinds of strains. Okay, at this very, very base level, you have your sativas and your indicas, but I mean, everyone that's ever tried any kind of cannabis knows that the spectrum is wide, right? And these things affect you in different ways. And what you're saying is that if I use your platform as an end user, I would be able to my doctor rather would be able to benefit of all the historical data that has been aggregated by other doctors into this platform based on the cases they've had, to be able to help him take better decisions for me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not just, I like how you said the entire history, because we talk about innovation in medicine, right? One of the biggest innovations is how we keep medical data. So gone are the times, hopefully, we think of those big files which no one ends up reading, and patients, it ends up being a new case every time.
Depends which country you're asking in, I guess. That's the
and still we don't have right implementation. But the point I'm getting at is ideally this is not just for cannabis, but for all medications. This is about, like we said, optimizing. So when you have this trail of actually owning my medical data, and being able to share that with my healthcare professionals on a platform that we can talk to each other in a discreet manner, a safe manner, because safety and patient confidentiality is very important here.
Of course.
This is essential to optimize the whole medical experience.
I mean, you're dealing with some of the world's most sensitive data. You know, I mean, it's
exactly
to do things in a not only compliant but an ethical way, right? I mean, it's not simple.
It's actually been really interesting to see to be able actually to work in two very different and yet very similar medical industries, which is both medtech and cannabis, which are totally different, you know, but because they both involve a degree of changing our attitudes to cannabis, or changing the way we keep files, attitudes towards, no, I don't want to adopt a new system, I want to keep my old files, my old paper files. In both cases, we are challenging the status quo. And I think you asked me earlier of what was my drive. I think my drive definitely in medicine, in medtech, in cannabis, is to challenge the status quo, and get benefit out of that change. You know, there's so much fear of the unknown, and we need to get over that fear in order to get the right answers.
And those are exactly the kind of people we need as far on the innovation side, right? Because like it solves the biggest problem in the industry, which is its pace, right? So listen, we're running short on time, so I'm just gonna sort of leave you with one question for anyone that's never considered cannabis as a medicine before. What are the top 3 most common ailments that you've had success with when prescribing cannabis?
So with cannabis, we talk about chronic pain, and rightly so. So with chronic pain, cannabis does really well. I've seen really good successes. It needs to be managed correctly. So the advice I would give is always get help. And here really it's not about challenging cannabis attitudes. Everyone approaches cannabis recreationally in their own way, but the medical use is an entirely different thing. So it always helps to consult a professional. Secondly, we're seeing a lot of autoimmune conditions which are benefiting so much. So we're seeing things. These normally fall into the category of chronic conditions, because unfortunately people tend to need to live with them, or to live with relapses of them across their life. It's not something that can be solved. So we have really good results, especially over the long term.
So can you give an example of what these might be to sort of people who aren't familiar with these terms? Because even me, as someone who's not a medical professional, it's like what kind of diseases are we talking about?
It's really all chronic conditions. So when you have conditions which are like multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, these are conditions where people are having a lot of success, not necessarily by just abandoning all their medicine and going to cannabis, but by also adding cannabis for certain symptoms or to manage certain problems. So that's another really big one. And there are some common ailments as well, because we talk about conditions. There are some common uses which cannabis fares very well, which are, for example, nausea. It might be a while, I think, before we see cannabis products legislated for simply for nausea, because there's a sort of over-the-counter aspect, right, to these medicines. But it is very useful, and has been already used in, for example, cancer patients who tend to suffer from nausea.
Of
But
course.
regardless of the chronic condition, cannabis can be very useful for these ailments, and it's also very useful for inflammation. So any acute inflammation, the data focuses on chronic, but acute inflammation is also something which cannabis works quite well for. So I think those would be a nice top three, maybe two chronic conditions, and also some common ailments that cannabis can be useful for. So
really, really insightful. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. If somebody wants to reach you, they can do it at celotex.com or DM via LinkedIn.
That's right.
So thank you so much for taking the time, and have a wonderful day, my friend.